When I was little, I didn't really follow game news very much. We had a personal computer, but I didn't really use it. So most of the new upcoming games I found out about was from the Wii's Nintendo channel. Specifically, I would come home from school and watch Nintendo Week, a show, as the name implies, with two guests who would talk about upcoming Nintendo games, and there would usually be some kind of skit or something along the side. So with that being said, though I didn't know about many upcoming games, I certainly knew about Galaxy 2. And having become a mega fan of the first one, I was extremely excited for this one. Of course, the question was, how was I going to get this? I didn't really have any money, maybe a little allowance or something like that. My birthday wasn't coming up, and it certainly wasn't Christmas time, so I was basically out of luck. Fast forward to the game's release, and after school, me and my older brother, were walking out, and we normally get picked up on this little driveway, but this time he was moving away, and he said that he was going to his friend's house to play Galaxy 2. But of course, I wasn't allowed to come, so it was just going to be him having fun and not me. Of course, I later realized that he wasn't telling me the full story, because when I got home, my mom sat me on the couch in our living room, and she told me to wait while she went into the bathroom. When she came back outside, her hands were behind her back, and after a few seconds, pulled her hands forward and revealed what else except... It might sound strange to say that Super Mario Galaxy 2 is in need of a defense. It is, after all, one of the most highly regarded games of all time. Its praises so endless and boundless, they may as well be proven fact. Yet despite this praise, Galaxy 2 may also be one of the most severely disrespected games I've ever seen, a disrespect that transcends one's feelings towards the game itself. Long has there been a debate about whether Galaxy 1 or Galaxy 2 is the superior game, a debate which still persists to this day. But while the arguments have continued over the years, certain facts about these two games have seemingly come to light as settled points of discussion. From its harshest detractors to its most ardent defenders, most have come to accept a simple dichotomy. Galaxy 1 is a beautifully atmospheric adventure, simultaneously capturing the grandioseness and epicness of the cosmos, while also capturing its peaceful solitude and lonely stillness. Galaxy 1 is a characteristically emotional video game, and its fondly remembered margins, the ever-brightening observatory, or the melancholic resonance of Rosalina's storybook, only serve to solidify this quality. Galaxy 2, on the other hand, is dumb, brainless fun. It has some exceptional level design, and an even greater variety than the already diverse level selection in its predecessor, but it lacks the emotional depths and maturity that made Galaxy 1 so profound. The claim is almost self-evident. From its very construction, Galaxy 2 seems utterly disinterested in investing the player in anything beyond Mario bouncing up and down oddly shaped planetoids. Galaxy 1's story was already the absolute basic Bowser kidnaps Peach plot, but somehow Galaxy 2 manages to make that story look like a sprawling epic. The story in 2 is presented with zero to no gravitas whatsoever. No giant party crashing, no giant space UFOs, no uprooting castles, no throwing Mario off of bridges. It's as if the game is simply going through the motions, giving its contractually obligated context before we can get to the part we all actually care about. The narrative is literally framed within the pages of a book Rosalina is reading to her Lumas, but the Lumas are way past their bedtime, and given that she spends all day wandering the universe, Rosalina's tired, so we need to get this story moving along as fast as possible. There exists no such optional story in Galaxy 2 as there was in 1. As such, 2 feels like it lacks an emotional center to it, and we're given no further details about any of the characters than the few sparse sentences they're allowed to speak over the course of the adventure. The game also feels far lighter than 1, choosing to spend a majority of its opening hours on brightly lit and sunny galaxies, as opposed to the darker, more deep space-themed levels of 1. The level design in general is far more linear in 2, giving it a more action-packed and snappy motion, a more level-like feeling than the larger structures and set pieces found in 1. Instead of domes in the observatory, traveling to new galaxies in 2 occurs via world maps, ripped straight out of more traditional Mario titles, rendering even the level select an air of artificiality, further reducing the line between stylistic presentation and prosaic, mundane menus. In many ways, Galaxy 2 feels like it lacks the artistry that made Galaxy 1 so special. At no point does Galaxy 2 make a convincing case that you are in fact not playing a video game, wandering and jumping around pre-made objects designed by a group of developers. It often feels like the game is simply Mario Galaxy More, a level pack wrapped around a mandated diegesis, which makes it all the more unconvincing. Yet this analysis is precisely the problem. Much time has been spent online focused on how Galaxy 1's design choices contribute further meaning to the game, adding layers and nuances that make the entire package surpass a mere collection of levels. But this same deference is not given to Galaxy 2. Instead, all of 2's design choices only seem to subtract, funneling the game downwards into a singular interpretation and path of success. Galaxy 2 is nothing more than its levels, and the choices it makes to contextualize those levels add up to no greater whole. I believe it is time to question this dichotomy. Is Galaxy 2 really so brainless? For about the first 11 or so years of my life, I was only allowed to play video games on weekends. In hindsight, this probably wasn't a bad decision. It put a greater emphasis on getting work done, becoming more studious, but it was also pretty arbitrary. I would constantly test the limits for what I could get away with. So sometimes I would ask my mom or dad if I could play this puzzle game on the weekdays, or educational games like Brain Age or something like that, and usually they would allow it. Sometimes when I got sick, video games were moderately allowed in that I would be able to play them, but only for, say, like 2 or 3 hours. And so I guess the question that all presents is, if I got my work done, why not just let me play on weekdays? I don't really know. Ultimately though, the whole strategy proved untenable because after we moved from my old house, the rule effectively dropped and was never reinforced, and it never became an issue. So I'm not really sure if that speaks to the ineffectiveness of the rule or the fact that I just internalized a sense of studiousness from the rule itself. Who knows? In any case, it meant that time was at a premium for playing games. I remember on weekends I would wake up at 6 a.m. and watch the sprinklers turn on and spray the lawn while the sun was rising just over the horizon. Me and my brother would often wake up early to watch Saturday morning cartoons, but sometimes if we woke up a little too early, before 6, it wasn't on yet, so we'd have to watch this home renovation show called This Old House, which we barely paid attention to. But later on in the day, we would start playing games, and we had 2 kind of setups so we wouldn't get in the way of each other. So upstairs, we had the PlayStation 2, and I would always choose to play Kingdom Hearts 2. But then eventually my brother would want to play on the PlayStation, so I'd go downstairs into this little porch area where we had a CRTV, and Galaxy 2 was a frequent choice there. I say all this because now that I'm older and I can play games whenever I want to and no one's gonna come down and demand I do my work first, I find that, ironically, I somehow have even less time to play games than I did as a child. Obviously, a lot of that can be attributed to increased responsibilities, as is natural, but I have a giant list of games that I haven't even touched but would like to, and I don't even know if I will get to. And I wonder, if Galaxy 2 had come out now, would it have become another one of those lost games, or would I have actually found the time to play it? Galaxy 2 acts as a galactic road trip, an attempt to bring the lost and the stolen back to their respective homes. This is most obviously represented through the game's progression itself. The journey has a start point all the way at the very left, and the game's end goal is all the way at the right, in one singular line of travel, passing by all of the universe's points of interest along the way. In that sense, the world map is the universe's intergalactic highway system, ley lines between the various tourist traps of the galaxy. Starship Mario itself fits neatly within this interpretation. It, unlike the observatory, is not a permanent home with kitchens, bedrooms, and gardens, rooms meant to sustain a family. Instead, as Lubba jokes, the ship is simply a car, its only function to embark on the long road ahead of it. Lubba also mentions that Mario can borrow the ship for a while, even changing its face to suit the new captain. And so, the car's very appearance is altered to represent its very temporary purpose. Stars act as fuel for the car, making each destination along the world map a sort of refuel, a quick pit stop to rest up and get a full tank of gas. The central power-up chamber of the face ship acts as the ever-growing souvenir collection on our trip, a variety of weird knickknacks and strange oddities that populate the various corners of the map. Not particularly useful sitting in glass containers, but neat nonetheless, a memento of the journey. Of course, along the way, we also pick up a merry band of explorers, people from around the cosmos who find our trip compelling enough and want a piece of it. Hitchhikers seeking to travel the universe along with us, perhaps picking up some souvenirs and friends of their own. In these ways, Galaxy 2 demonstrates its apparent shallowness as a feature instead of a flaw. The world map is not a mere means to an end, a superficial level select menu. Starship Mario is not a pale imitation of hubs prior, an obligation that needed to be fulfilled. The game's lighter tone and more frenetic nature are not necessarily representative of a disinterest in narrative. We don't spend less time in any one galaxy because the game is disinterested in establishing a coherent atmosphere. Rather, these are all conscious and considered choices which add meaningful context to the game and its intentions, providing the game with its own identity that separates itself from what came before. It would make no sense to stop and smell the roses and explore grand vistas in a game that wishes to construct itself as a fast-paced road trip. Galaxy 2 revels in its constant momentum and linearity, using these features to construct its own unique self, a far cry from the derivative bliss it is often labeled as. Alright, welcome to my objective review of Super Mario Galaxy 2.
How the fuck did you get into my house?
With AI on the collective mind recently, an uncomfortable question has arisen. How special are Wait a minute, haven't I said this already? Reuse in video games, or really in any medium, is often regarded as a bad thing, a sign of laziness. At its worst, it can feel actively deceptive, a game attempting to pretend it's something else when it so obviously isn't. But the truth is, reuse is simply a natural, adaptive part of development. What's important about reuse isn't whether or not it exists, but how. Given just the right amount of coaxing and a little recontextualization, reuse can actively enhance a game rather than hinder, all while saving on the precious practicalities of production. Mario Galaxy 2 has a surprising amount of reuse. Much like Galaxy 1, a whopping 35 stars, over a fourth of the game this time, are dedicated purely to comets, which are simply remixes of prior levels. Of course, I would argue most of the comet stars in 2 are of higher quality than 1's. There's a greater selection of comet types, a majority of speedrun comets now feature extremely limited time and force you to collect clocks, which alters the play of the levels in a far more impactful way than simply giving 5 minutes. Many comets are completely fine with changing the levels outright, making them at least partially different than what came before. But these changes aren't really the important point. What is important is that Galaxy 2's reuse extends far beyond the scope of its predecessor. When Galaxy 1 reused, it was mostly content to reuse elements only from itself. Galaxy 2, on the other hand, pulls far more liberally from prior Mario titles as well. Obviously, 2 repeats many ideas from the first game, both on a conceptual level, but also on a level-by-level basis. Several galaxies in the special world are ripped wholesale, and elsewhere, smaller level elements are sneakily placed in otherwise brand new levels, typically centering the reused portion of the stage around a slightly different gimmick than the one used in Galaxy 1. And of course, I shouldn't have to mention that Galaxy 2 also pulls from Mario 64, most obviously with Throwback Galaxy. But amidst all of the reuse, it feels like Galaxy 2 has a particular affinity for Sunshine. Starshine Beach, beyond the similar theming, marks the return of the Piantas as a species. Sunshine also gets its own legacy stage in the form of Twisty Trials Galaxy. Yoshi makes his playable reappearance after his absence in Galaxy 1. Bowser Jr. continues his trend of boss fights in ridiculously oversized mechs, though in this case that certainly isn't specific to just Galaxy 2. Bowser feels noticeably less menacing in this game, seemingly more obsessed over getting a slice of cake than in galactic domination or whatever he's after. Indeed, the lighter and brighter tone that Galaxy 2 is often criticized as having feels a lot more symmetrical with Sunshine's general atmosphere. Taken all together, Galaxy 2 in many ways feels like an anniversary game, a celebration of 3D Mario's history over the years, and that's probably not an unreasonable reading, considering 2010 was the 25th anniversary of Super Mario Bros. Release. In that sense, Galaxy 2's road trip sensibilities extend beyond just the framing of the game. Galaxy 2 sometimes almost literally acts as a journey down memory lane, a sightseeing tour of all of Mario's best and brightest adventures. So it feels quite fitting that a game about a galactic road trip would ultimately find so much in common from a game about Mario and company taking an exciting tropical vacation. After what must have been my, 30th, 35th, 40th playthrough of Galaxy 2, I remember being in Supermassive Galaxy, of course playing on that CRT TV I mentioned earlier, when suddenly, out of nowhere, this giant green lightning bolt flashed through the middle of the screen and everything just shut off instantly. I had no idea what happened, so I turned the TV on again and everything seemed fine, but after maybe 20 to 30 minutes of playtime, the lightning bolt came back and the TV shut off instantly. It was pretty clear that the TV was done for, but that didn't stop me from trying to get a few last minutes of playtime in, carefully attempting to finish the level I was working on before anything shut off and I lost any progress. And what's interesting is that with the death of that TV, I can't really remember anything else about Galaxy 2 in my childhood. Did I just stop playing the game after that, or were the rest of the playthroughs I did really unremarkable? I have some vague memories of discovering green stars for the first time, but considering I knew I played the game many times before that, you would have think I'd found the green stars already. At the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if I wasn't skilled enough to get all 120 regular stars, so I suppose it's possible, but seems strange that there's this gap in my memory. Either way, it's really a moot point because shortly after moving the Wii upstairs, we moved away from that house, and that saw a significant decrease in the number of Galaxy 2 playthroughs. I was all ready to begin the next chapter of my life, whatever that may be. It's impossible to discuss Galaxy 2's design choices fully without discussion of Miyamoto, or more accurately, discussion of Miyamoto. If there's one debate that's raged on for about as long as which Galaxy game is better, it's whether or not Miyamoto has had an overly adversarial relationship to the importance of storytelling in video games. I have no intention of rehashing the entire debate here, so if you want to learn some more about it, I've linked a video in the description that I believe outlines a majority of the evidence. However, I also believe there's more to add to this discussion, a point about stories in general that often gets overlooked when analyzing Miyamoto's general design philosophy. Perhaps the most well-known point of comparison between the two Galaxy games is that one's story is far better than 2's. I think it's about time this argument was scrutinized. Galaxy 1, while the presentation of its story was often far more involved than 2's, often left a lot to be desired. There's very little forward momentum at all. Consider the progression of the domes as you move through the observatory. Depending on if you play your stars right, it's very possible that the bedroom could be your final dome of the game. But what exactly about the bedroom screams climactic? But it does feel haphazard. We're about to travel to the center of the universe, and it's a quiet, peaceful location, but not in a way altogether different from the domes before. It's also technically possible that the engine room or the garden could be your final dome as well, but here it's still a bit incongruous. I suppose the engine room could be justified in the sense that it is the beating heart of the observatory, and the garden does feel characteristically different from all of the other domes. Still, if I were to take pictures of each dome interior, scramble them around, and ask someone who's never played Galaxy 1 before to match the domes to their respective spot in the order we visit them, that person would probably struggle to justify putting any singular dome before or after another. To be fair, the observatory, as it lights up over the course of the game, the music swelling as we ascend up to the peak, does provide this climactic sense, but it feels like the domes themselves were less considered from an individual perspective than they were as coherent locations belonging to the observatory. More troubling though is the level selection. The first galaxy in each of these domes feels absolutely inappropriate. Gusty Galaxy may be epic, but certainly not in the sense that you're kicking off the last leg of the journey. Far worse is is Golden Leaf, which is a considerably less climactic galaxy than Gusty Garden, and whose first impression is that of a honey hive clone. I suppose Deep Dark is, well, dark, but more in that random ghost house vibe you might find in a new Super Mario Bros. Stage than a declarative statement about the ending of the game. In sum, the freedom to end the game at various different points hampers the ability to create solid emotional stakes within the player. It's not that these 3 levels are bad per se, it's just that in playing their role as the potential first level of the final world, none of these galaxies feel up to the task. Now compare to Galaxy 2. Instead of domes, each world gives us a new space ambiance to work with on both the world map and on Starship Mario. And if we were to perform the same image scrambling task we did with the dome interiors, I think the progression between each successive world is much more obvious, at least in a general sense, indicating the steps of our trip as we travel further and further away from home. I mean, if nothing else, someone who's never played the game before probably isn't putting the nice blue sky after the giant black hole. World 5 in particular mounts a strong opening. The background features clusters of spiral galaxies far out in the distance, like eyes slowly observing our progress. It feels cold, distant, as if we've journeyed well beyond the point of no return into completely uncharted territory. Lubba comments that this area is pretty well protected and that we're moving in on the enemy's home base, and that point is no better emphasized than in the world's first galaxy, Space Storm. We immediately land in, welcomed by dark, billowing clouds surround us, lightning flashes across the sky, and harsh, unwelcoming machinery blocks our path. If there were ever a way to tell us we're unwelcome, this is it. World 6 has another strong introduction. As the final world in the game, the black hole looming in the background, we rush into the first level to be greeted with lava plumes and exploding volcanoes, and all the while, it couldn't be a more exhilarating opening. And in the ways I've laid out here, I would go as far as to argue that Galaxy 2 offers a more coherent, visually compelling story than Galaxy 1. Video games are a unique medium, with the potential to do things no other medium can. And part of that potential is the ability to tell stories in ways that go beyond cutscenes and dialogue, beyond the trappings that we consider the traditional storytelling format. The most obvious way video games can do this is by incorporating the gameplay and the presentation themselves into the narrative, forming a story not through explicit plot beats or narration, but through the various different elements of the game. In that sense, video games are uniquely suited to tell a sort of emergent story, one that doesn't necessarily exist on paper, but only when all of its constituent elements have been combined to form a greater whole. As in the examples I provided, the dialogue may be a start, but it's only once you step into Space Storm and Melty Monster, see the harsh environments, the triumphant music, play the levels themselves, that the meaning of the dialogue becomes clear. These galaxies indicate that the journey is approaching its end, and the stakes are, sometimes literally, heating up. I'm sure everyone recognizes the standard storytelling formula that's used to diagram the general flow of story progression. I've always found this graph to be sort of odd because, well, at least on every version of this chart I've seen, its axes aren't labeled. Presumably, the x-axis represents time, as different phases of the story proceed one after another, but the y-axis is particularly perplexing. The climax is positioned at the peak, as the name would imply, but the peak of what exactly? What is this mysterious increasing line representing? The most obvious answer is that the chart is showing increasing tension, with the climax being the highest point of tension. But tension in stories is not a thing that can be quantitatively analyzed or operationally defined. Even the most exciting, action-packed scene in a movie could be dreadfully boring to someone disinterested in the larger context of the narrative. Stories, then, are ultimately something felt. That point is important, because it demonstrates that in the most fundamental way possible, emergent storytelling is just as much storytelling as the more traditional form is. Characters, plots, dialogue, these are ultimately incidental attributes, means to an end, flavors whose main purpose is to get you, the audience, to emotionally resonate with the work in the way that the creators wish. As such, if that resonance can be achieved with no characters at all, no plot, no dialogue, then why should that be viewed as any less valid a way of storytelling? I would argue it's not. Galaxy 2 is often criticized for having no story, but that simply isn't true. It's right there. It has the peaks and the valleys, the increasing tension, the surprises and the quietness, the climax and the denouement, and sure, it's not perfect. We could argue whether or not things like Throwback Galaxy really works or belongs as one of the last galaxies before the finale, but I think the general structure is there. Galaxy 2 has a story in every way that matters. It just represents that story primarily through the specific mechanisms of the medium. Which brings us right back to Miyamoto. I do not believe it can be seriously entertained that Miyamoto has a deep dislike of story, unless of course we limit the concept of story down to a frustratingly narrow definition, one in which only the explicit pieces, the text on the screen, the characters, the individual plot details and continuity are all that counts. And even that argument would fail, because I don't believe he dislikes traditional storytelling. Miyamoto's philosophy has its strengths and weaknesses, as any philosophy inevitably does, but I would argue story is not one of those weaknesses. Suggesting Miyamoto's focus is solely on gameplay over story is misleading, because the kind of experience he's attempting to engender with his focus on gameplay is precisely the same kind of experience he'd be attempting to engender if he focused on story instead. Gameplay produces story. They serve the same ultimate purpose. When it comes to storytelling, there's a fairly common pejorative phrase that gets thrown around a lot: style over substance. And while that phrase is probably true in many cases, it also ignores the very real possibility that the style is the substance. In trying to make these two Galaxy videos, it's come to my attention how fallible memory really is. I'm pretty young, but recounting these older childhood stories of playing these games has gotten a lot harder. I think I remember these stories fondly, but I don't really know how much I'm making up at this point. I'm sure there's some level of unconscious embellishment, and clearly some details have faded away, but I'd like to think that most of what I'm saying is fairly accurate. In some ways, I think this is my fault. I have little to no records of my early childhood memories. I did have a camera when I was little, or at least I was borrowing one of my parents' cameras, and I remember shortly after finding what a Let's Play was, I pointed the camera at one of the TVs and started playing Pokemon Rumble and putting that on VHS. More broadly, I didn't really take pictures or write in a journal or anything. Even now, my phone's photo gallery is practically empty, mostly just pictures of assignments or things someone drew on a chalkboard. But there's very few pictures of any places I've been or experiences I've had, and this didn't really bother me, because I figured if it was something truly important, I wouldn't need a picture, I would just remember it. However, even a few years later, I realized this probably was a mistake. The holes in my memory are only going to get bigger the older I get, and while a picture itself may only be worth 1,000 words, its true use might be that it unlocks thousands more. When discussing the Galaxy games, I think it's easy to miss the broader context. While these two games certainly do have their differences, they're on the whole very similar games, and the differences they do have are a matter of degree, not kind. Galaxy 1 may have a broader focus on story than Galaxy 2, but only marginally so. When we get down into the details, it's not like Galaxy 1 is telling a story any different than what is typical for a Mario game, and that emergent storytelling I keep harping on about is hardly an exclusive feature to 2. Galaxy 1 may have more free roaming levels and choices than Galaxy 2, but they're both in the end fairly linear games, especially compared to 64, Sunshine, and Odyssey. Galaxy 1 may be more grandiose in its presentation, but Galaxy 2 isn't lacking in big set pieces either. These games are largely two slightly different interpretations on the same material. The problem comes in then when people would deny Galaxy 2 has its own unique interpretation on the material at all. But as I've hopefully demonstrated up to this point, that's really not the case. And the design decisions that usually act as points of criticism are in fact precisely what inform Galaxy 2's unique identity. The observatory was a neat and thoughtful hub area, but a similar type of hub wouldn't have made sense in the context of 2. This is not a game of observation and contemplation, and Starship Mario perfectly emphasizes 2's more external-facing interests. People bemoan the lack of deep characterization, particularly the absence of something like Rosalina's storybook, but where in 2 would such an addition make sense? Is Lubba a character that really needs a picture book illustrating his secret, tragic backstory? Is that really in line with the tone of the game or the character? I don't think so. Galaxy 2 may treat its more traditional narrative like an afterthought, but why force the game to spend more time on something it's so utterly disinterested in? After all, if we include the more implicit, emergent qualities of storytelling, I would genuinely argue that Galaxy 2 tells a better story. Ironically, despite all the people claiming that Galaxy 2 is merely a derivative sequel, the game seems to only take criticism when it deviates from the foundation Galaxy 1 laid out. And indeed, the solution to all of Galaxy 2's ills is to make it more like its predecessor, to give it a more expansive hub, give it a bigger focus on narrative, give it more quote-unquote atmosphere, choices which would ultimately serve to make Galaxy 2 even more derivative to 1. This is not to suggest that these things couldn't have been added in a way that makes them feel markedly different. Of course it's possible, but I'm just not convinced that the game would really benefit from these things. Galaxy 2 is far more than just brainless fun. It has its own unique views and perspectives. It has that oh so important intellectual integrity, and I would happily call it a worthy successor to one of the generation's greatest games.